Hey there everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first two novels, one the start of a series, one a standalone. And on my channel I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of all writing, and that's the characters. And the heart of the characters is their psychology. So that's the angle I like to take with pretty much everything I talk about on my channel. So today I am doing another of what I've been calling my trope diagnosis series. That's where I take a popular writing, or in some cases just a media trope, and I kind of delve into the psychology behind it. So today I wanted to tackle actually one of my favorites that for some reason I keep forgetting to bring up, and that is the trope of the quest. So this trope you probably also heard called the hero's journey. It's essentially where our main character is given the drive to go on some quest, something they have to do, whether it's something they have to find, someone they have to meet, someone they have to defeat. They have to go from point A to point B to solve whatever the conflict is. So those of you that have been on my channel a while know that Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite books of all time, along with The Hobbit and The Silmarillion. And my favorite ones are the ones regarding the quest. I like the Hobbit quest and I like the Lord of the Rings quest. For several reasons. One, as a writer, I don't like to stay in one place very long. I like to move around. That's why a lot of my stories have multiple points of view, so that you're not always in one location. I think particularly in fantasy and sci-fi, there is so much potential for all these creative landscapes and peoples and languages and all this stuff that I don't want to just stay in one spot. So that's one reason I like the quest, is because you get to move around, and it's a good way to do a lot of your world building, because if you're going with your characters and they're discovering new places, then you get to explain your world to your readers through the characters as they're given the information. So it lets you avoid all the nasty info dumping because it makes sense for the plot. But the main reason I like this trope is because of the psychology behind it. And the main psychology I think behind the quest is essentially self-discovery. I think particularly, like I said, in the genres of sci-fi and fantasy, this is really a way for your characters to discover what's important to them, who they are, what they want to stand for, that kind of thing. And one thing that you'll notice is that characters that go on a quest, they're usually at either the beginning or the end of a developmental phase. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to use Erickson's phases of development here. So there's 8 of them. So like I said, there are 8 main phases to 8 main stages. And each of these stages is essentially, you are developing your personality and healthy coping skills and that kind of thing. But with each stage, there's something in particular you're supposed to essentially discover or develop. So the first one is trust versus mistrust. This is where your bonding occurs, where you discover essentially, is my world safe? Is my world not safe? Who can I trust? Who can I depend on? That's trust versus mistrust. So I'm not going to go over all of them, because I think in terms of a hero's quest, you're usually going to fall into the later categories. So I'm going to start with, let's see here. For a quest, I'm going to start with stage 5, which is identity versus role confusion. This is about age 12 to 18. So if you're having a quest in a YA, this is kind of where you're going to fall. And this area is, I think, where the quest makes a lot of sense to people, because it's essentially discovering what's important to you and not necessarily what you were taught. This is where your morals go through that nice shift of, instead of following morals because it's what you were taught or it's what mom and dad would do, you follow them because they make sense to you. And when you go on a quest, your hero is encountering lots of different scenarios where they have to make a lot of moral decisions. And especially lately, some of these moral decisions are very much on the gray spectrum. And I think that's good because that is kind of what teaches someone who is working towards adulthood that there isn't always going to be a solid black and white answer. It's not going to be, oh, well, we're going to do this because this way, kills thousands of people or whatever. But it's not always that simple. And I think the quest scenario kind of introduces situations where your hero doesn't always have a clear-cut answer. Sometimes both options suck. And they have to kind of decide within themselves, which option can I live with the most? And I think that's very important for just moral development, is deciding not only what your morals are and which ones you're going to stand up for, but can you stand up to them against opposition? Because most of the time that's what they're going to also hit on this hero's journey, is opposition. Whether it's in the form of conflict with teammates, whether it's in the form of actual someone trying to stop said quest. There's lots of ways that it manifests, but the idea is basically you're going to get hit with all these obstacles, and part of growing up is figuring out, how do I maneuver these? How do I figure out what is the best thing for me to do? Some of my favorite stories, I think, are the ones that take this scenario and they pit them almost against what they were raised with. Like if they were raised that, for example, I guess I'll use this example. Let's say they were raised in an environment where they were taught that you never use violence whatsoever. And as they go along this journey, they find that they can't always talk their way out of a problem. They can't always convince said people that are attacking them not to attack them, regardless of what they may have been taught. And so that forces them into a situation where, okay, what I've been taught no longer applies. Now what do I do? And I think that's fascinating to read. It's interesting. It makes us emphasize with the character because we've all been there, because we've all either have passed through it, will pass through it, or it will, this growing up section where we figure out our morals. Yeah, we all go through that. And so I think that automatically creates some form of connection. Now, that's not the only one, though. There's also there's two more stages that I think also fall in the hero's journey. There is what we call intimacy versus isolation. That's about 19 to 40-ish. This is basically where you figure out what you want to do with your life. Do you want to have a partner? This is where you develop your strong relationships. So in adolescence, you start to develop relationships separate from your parents. So your friends become more important, and you start to essentially start to build those connections. But about this age is where they become more intimate, they become more personal, and that's where you might get the romantic angle that a lot of stories like to throw in, which I am not against. I'm not against a romantic angle. But the thing is, this isn't just romantic. This can also apply to platonic relationships. So if you have a character and you don't necessarily want to do a romantic relationship, you don't have to. You can stick with just them developing relationships with people who are going to be strong friends, stick by their side, that kind of thing. Let's see here. I'm trying not to mention the same stories over and over again, but whenever I think of platonic relationships, I automatically go to Lord of the Rings. But I think it is a good example of Tolkien essentially took the relationships that he forged in the war, when he fought in the war, and he applied them to essentially the fellowship of characters. And So that's why we see this close bond, this connection that builds over the story, and this devotion to one another strictly because they care for each other. And that's something that the quest can do if you're in this stage. Is it's more what I would call like a trial by fire, where essentially you have this group of people, sometimes together because they're already friends, sometimes they're complete strangers, and they're put on this quest together for reasons, whatever reason you want to use. And along the way is when they learn from each other because they have to depend on each other. And this is something I'll bring up. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital setting. And you have to have a strong trust with your coworkers in that situation. So you kind of form this almost brother-sister like bond with your coworkers that you work with. I mean, I had a job before that when I just worked in a daycare center, and I liked all my coworkers. We were civil with each other. We had conversations. We were nice with each other. But I still have strong relationships with people that I worked with in the hospital, and I haven't worked there since like 2016. Was it? Yeah, 2016. So I think that is a scenario that kind of happens with the quest. Is you have characters that are put in a situation where their livelihood depends on one another, and so when that's the case, you tend to work through conflict a little, not necessarily easier or better, but you don't have the option to not work it out, essentially. So I think that's kind of what happens when you have a quest situation in this stage. And the third one I'll bring up is one I see the least, and I actually would like to see it a lot more. And this one is kind of a blend of the last two stages. So stage 7 is generativity versus stagnation. That's basically where you want to make your mark on the world, essentially. And then the last stage is ego integrity versus despair. And that's about from 65 and up until death, basically. And that's basically where you look back over your life and say, did I live my life how I wanted to? So I'm going to put these two stages together because I think they both apply here. When you have an older hero who goes on their quest, it usually is because of that I want to make a mark thing. I want to leave a legacy behind. I want to have done something. And again, I'm going to reference The Hobbit here, because Bilbo, when he goes on the journey in The Hobbit, he's 50 years old, which is middle-aged for a hobbit. So about the same as it is for humans, give or take. And when it starts out, he doesn't really have a drive to go on this adventure. He's like, I've got my books, I've got my fireplace, I'm good, leave me alone. But he's driven to go when he hears the dwarves singing about their lost home, their lost gold, and places that he's only read about. And Tolkien says something, quote unquote, Tookish woke up in him, and he goes with them. But what ends up happening is by the end of this journey, he goes through, meets elves, he fights with trolls, with orcs, and he ends up losing 3 people that he grew very close to. So, as Gandalf said, which is actually one of my favorite quotes from the movies and the books,
the world is not in your books and maps. It's out there. You'll have a tale or two to tell of your own when you come back.
Can you promise that I will come back?
No. And if you do, you will not be the same.
and he's right. When Bilbo comes back to the Shire after this whole adventure is over with, he is not the same, and he is never the same. He remains kind of this eccentric personality that goes off and visits elves and he's not the same hobbit he was when he left, because he found that he needed to essentially live his life and not necessarily just read about it, which he was content with before this point. But come that age 50 and Gandalf shows up and asks him to go on this quest, and he ends up going, and it literally changes the rest of his life, and in no small way changes the rest of the course of the world, actually. And I really like that angle of someone going to make a mark, to leave a legacy, to feel like they've done something. I think a lot of times the hero's quest is dominated by, like, you know, the young adults, the teenagers, which, like I talked about, I get why that is. I mean, it's fun. It's a great way to explore those characters. But I want to see more of these older characters going on these quests, these life-changing events. Because your life doesn't end just because you passed a certain age point. I mean, your body might slow down a little bit, but that doesn't mean that you still can't go on these adventures and achieve great things. And I wouldn't mind seeing that message put out there a little more, that, you know, hey, here's a hero that's would be considered past his prime, but he's still going to go on this adventure because it's needed, and he wants to make a difference, and that kind of thing. I think that's important to put out there. So that is my digging into the quest trope. Like I said, this is one of my favorite tropes, in no small part because of my favorite books. All have them. So, but I do think it's interesting because the quest in and of itself is reflective of psychological change. I like that kind of an analogy, I guess. I like that what happens physically in a quest is reflective of what's happening mentally in a person. I think that makes it easy for people to connect with, and I think it makes it easier to understand. So I hope you guys found it interesting. As always, if you have any thoughts, suggestions, comments, drop them below. I'll get to them as soon as I can. I try to upload every Sunday, every Wednesday, maybe throw an extra video in there when I can. If you don't want to miss whenever I upload, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so you don't. And until next time, I hope you guys have a good one and stay safe.